Tim, welcome to this
Thank you,
podcast.
Joe.
Thank you.
It's terrific to be here.
And thanks for joining me. The social license to operate and the links between that and restructuring. In Abu Dhabi, the Resolve conference during Abu Dhabi Finance Week, you spoke about this issue of the social license to operate in the face of insolvency. And so that's our topic. Tell us about the conference, what you've got out of that, and in particular, what the thrust and themes of your talk were.
So Abu Dhabi Finance Week, about 15,000 people come.
Good grief.
And there's days allocated to private equity, to family offices, to crypto, to infrastructure, renewables. And part of it is also a day allocated to sort of, if you like, the legal profession and those associated with it. And it's called Resolve. And Linda Fitzallen is a former registrar of the Supreme Court of New South Wales, worked closely with people like Tom Bathurst, and has been working as the CEO of the ADGM, Abu Dhabi Global Markets, the courts, in the court system there, running the courts. Abu Dhabi, like Dubai, has allocated space, has created English common law within the UAE, within the state, the Abu Dhabi is likewise in Dubai. So to give confidence to investors to invest under and then pursuant to contracts written under English common law. And the judges of those courts are drawn from essentially superior courts from around the world with the highest integrity. And they wanted to have, they're pushing boundaries. They're pushing boundaries with AI. And what she wanted to do is to sort of challenge the paradigms. And that sort of what came to mind there was in the context of having seen lots of disputes through my career, and a lot of it in insolvency, was to sort of look at the impact of the social license as companies and governments and stakeholders face up to insolvencies, and how they react and should react, and how they should try and work together to try and potentially get a better outcome than sometimes might be the case if it's just left to languish and then head into some form of formal administration.
Has it always been the case as restructuring people that we always think we're facing headwinds, right? We're always building a narrative around that, oh, these are tough times, these are uncertain times. I don't know how many presentations I've delivered where I've said that over the years. Although, do you think there's something a bit unique about where we are now?
We're facing a lot of disruption. AI is going to disrupt things. Existing company business models are going to get disrupted significantly, I suspect, with AI. So, yes, there's going to be, I think, a lot more happening in that space. And I think society's expectations have shifted. They're certainly shifted from what we had, 25 years ago.
In that context, what's driving that change? Why do you think governments are more attuned now to the damage that's being done? And why do you think it is that there's more of a public interest? I mean, these failures have always affected people. What's driving that social interest, do you think?
Social media has created expectations. I mean, the speed with which information flows locally and globally. At a company level, there's a war for talent. So, people want to work for good organisations. Consumer sentiment can switch so quickly now because people see what's happening. They're watching, social media all the time. You've got a lot more activist NGOs, for example. So all of that is creating, I think, there are forces, there's more powerful forces at work than there were 25 years ago.
Government agencies are actually accepting that obligation as well in a different way. So we will keep you safe during COVID, right? We will protect the climate for you regardless of the cost. We can engineer and influence the climate, believe it or not, if you believe that. That's as a government, that's now our contract with you. So not only we've sort of got a contract, don't we? We've got offer and acceptance here. The public want it, and the government are saying we can do it,
Yeah.
regardless of the cost.
Yeah. And, I'm not close to Rex Airlines, but you can see there that there was, if you didn't have a service to rural Australia, then there were going to be people in all parts of this country who just couldn't, get to Sydney. They couldn't deal with health issues. They couldn't see doctors. They couldn't visit children or relatives. So the government steps up, and I don't think in that situation there's been a few mumbles about how it was done, maybe how much was done. But that was that. If you go back in the GFC, and I was down at Reuters in Canary Wharf the morning where me being addressed by Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling, the Chancellor, and they were late. And there was about 40 or 50 people there. And they walked in and they apologised for being late. And they said, sorry, we've just been delayed because we've just part nationalised Lloyds and RBS. And I...
Sorry about that. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry. And I thought to myself, this is a moment of history. Here
Yes.
I am, part nationalisation. If I can just sort of reflect, there was a number of people there with very fancy names, double-barrel names.
Indeed.
And they're all sirs. And so Gordon Brown was asking questions of Sir Lancelot and Sir Humphrey and that. And anyhow, I put my hand up, and at the time I was with ANZ Bank, and I said, my name's Tim Lestrange, and I'm from ANZ Bank, one of the 9 AAA banks left in the world. And the audience burst out laughing, and they also said, "Not for long." But there was, why would I tell the story? There's an example of the government stepping in.
Yes.
And you can see in moments of crisis which affect a community, a broader, a broad community, yes, they step in. You can see at the moment with Star, who's had their hand out for that. But it hasn't, the state governments, Queensland, New South Wales, haven't, at least to date, responded to their pleas.
It's really about determining which of those are mission critical, isn't it? And that's the rub here, because, we'll talk about this. I'm running failing companies too. I'd like a check for all of them. So
I'm sure you would.
Is government supposed to solve all of these problems, and how do we? And so then is it an obligation of taxpayers to solve all the problems, and have we socialised failure?
Yeah, no. Look, I think the answer is no. You can't. The government's not expected to put its, to step in all the time, and otherwise it'd be a long list of people like Joe Hayes with their hands out.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But it's so it is. It's the right circumstances, but it does seem to me that it's the ingredients are pretty much. It's got to be a significant state or federal issue. It's got to affect a lot of different people. There's a lot of people going to affect their livelihoods, the community, whatever, safety maybe there. So, but I think, otherwise, there's still a lot to be said for, we operate in a free market economy, and free market forces should be allowed to work. And if that's good. If people are running inefficient and ineffective companies and they're not good managers, well, so be it that they go under.
So there's a contract between government and the public, but is there now a contract between companies and the public? So the role of Qantas on The Voice, the role of Woolies in Australia Day, the role of the Institute of Company Directors and the ASX in relation to governance, the role of KPMG in relation to just about everything.
I think where it's become far more divided has been on, what might be in the community seen as being itself divisive issues, and a board taking what some would say a political issue, backing one side or the other, backing one side or perhaps not saying anything on the other side. And I think that's, the rules and the thought and the guidance on that, I think have still got to play out. But, I think there's some areas where it's incontrovertible. Yes, they've got a role to play.
Yes.
On the others, I suspect a lot of boards going forward will have watched closely.
Yes, a bit less self-serving in relation
and
to some
they
of
watched
those.
the pushback and the criticism of boards in relation to things like, for example, The Voice or Australia Day. And I still think that they'll be playing roles, but do we see companies playing roles in energy and uranium and taking views on that? I suspect so most of them will probably want to steer clear of those political issues.
Let's talk then about the expectation of the public for the delivery of a social licence in the restructuring sector. So does the social licence in a struggling company extend the same way? Do you think a struggling company should be looking beyond its stakeholders in the order of priority into the public interest, and where do we draw that line, do you think?
At a practical level, it may be difficult to define in the abstract, but at a practical level, it won't take that long to understand, a Joe Hayes talking to a company and environment. Who are the key stakeholders? Who do we have to get into the room? What sort of buy-in do we expect from them? And what if and then other issues arise, which is what if they don't want to participate?
The company can't be expected to turn up in its baseball cap and bat and sort that out. They're just and so where do you find the leadership? Government won't want to lead because they'll be writing the check, and the company can't lead, and the banks can't lead, and
so it was interesting. I mean, as a lawyer, sometimes we all go into rooms thinking we know the solution, and but it was put to me by a very large global company, how difficult it is in that context to actually convene the meeting, to be at the head of the table, so to speak, wearing the baseball cap, the peak cap of the company that they represent, and talk to everyone there saying, thank you all very much for turning up here. It's great, and we're all here together to solve this. And everyone just looks at you with the peak cap and just says, well, we know why you're here.
Yeah, that's right.
And what was said to me was it would make a lot more sense to have an independent facilitator who could talk to us, could talk to the creditors, could talk to the minority interests, could talk to the government, could talk to Labor, the labour force representatives, could talk to the off-takers, and come back. Now, this is not in a mediation on Wednesday week where we all get in a room. This would take time and facilitation. The person needs to understand precisely what the government's interest and motives might be. If a lot of the and likewise for the lenders. So it's more a facilitative role over time. But I was very much struck by the insight from that particular organisation to sort of say, and I can't talk about what example they were citing, but they'd gone through this, and they were reflecting on how it could have been done better and why it wasn't done better.
And I know it's not a criticism of the binary nature of advice. I give advice to clients, so do you. And I do think, though, so I've been guilty of circumstances where you look at a problem myopically for your client, and there's many advisors in the room, and there's many principals, and you're saying, well, we're here to achieve this, and we're banging our heads against the wall for the banks or whoever we're doing it, and here's what we want, and in case you're all wondering, here's another letter that says that. And so this is a process that is designed to break that down. So on the most material disputes, hopefully, where you can't get advisors to change their tune on that, you can bring in someone to, as you say, over time, make.
Well, everyone in the company knows when there's an issue arises. There's an issue with a product. There's an issue with a geography. There's an issue with a division, and there's an issue with a customer. And it's going to get nasty. I was meeting with people yesterday who were very much involved with high net worth and family offices. Intergenerational issues, succession issues, we've seen playing out globally in families. People know when there's a problem, and getting people to meet privately with them. So privately with the banks, with people with the right level of autonomy and authority. And too often people come to meetings and they send representatives and, they're not the right people. People say to me, goodness sake, the people who came to the meeting were the people who wrote the deal.
Yes, that's right.
They're the ones,
Yeah.
they have a skin in the game.
Yeah.
So, getting the right people in the room and meeting them privately and then understanding what their real objectives are.
Yeah, and getting people away from scorched earth takes time too, and courage and dropping the defences, and you won't do that in large groups and make the first move quite often.
So there's an organisation in London called CEDA, the Centre for Efficient Dispute Resolution, which has been running for 20 plus years. And there, when you look at the way they teach, mediation, they are very much focused on having the principals, the parties, do the talking. More parties, less lawyers. Opening statements, if you have to have a plenary session, opening statements, short statements by the parties, not the lawyers. And their view is if it doesn't work out, the lawyers will sort it out later on because it'll be in court.
Yes.
But the big difference is if you get the parties to talk, and sometimes, funnily enough, sometimes there's even just who's going to go first, who might say sorry.
Yes, indeed.
One of the questions I like to ask in a joint venture breakup is, when you went into this joint venture, Joe, it must have seemed like a good idea. It's like marriage. And something's happened in the last 10 years, 7 years in this joint venture. Tell me about it.
What was it?
What was it? Yeah. And you unpick it. Now, maybe then there's reconciliation possible. Yeah. But if not, let's have a sensible separation, geographically, intellectual property, whatever, how we're going to carve it all up. But it's complicated matters, getting everyone in a room may not be the right way to go. My experience with the high and the mighty, the powerful, you're not going to get everyone in a room. Indeed. It's more an emissary style, going backwards and forwards.
And I agree with you. And let's talk about court processes, because, like you, I say, the longer we can maintain principle to principle discussion here, the better off we are. So, the courts have a place. I mean, where do you see the courts in resolving disputes then, and what do you think of the issues with that? I mean, once you commence a proceeding, it's hard to stop the momentum in a proceeding, and largely the outcomes are pretty binary. They don't really reflect the rights and interests both parties have. You're putting yourself in the hands of a judge who's doesn't have a stake in the outcome, and people generally leave unhappy.
I mean, first and foremost, you've got to have a court system, and that's essential. And you've got to have a court system which works effectively and efficiently. And we are very lucky in Australia. And I often say to people, one of the reasons why arbitration, I think, historically hasn't been that popular in Australia. It has a role to play absolutely in international affairs. But in Australia, it's because our court system is actually so good. And, we have actually a healthy competition between the feds and the states on that. And that's good. And they're bright, they're capable, but they're independent, and, their integrity is paramount. And that's not true in every jurisdiction. That's why if you go to the Middle East, what they've done there, and they've done in Singapore, the Singapore International Court, and Hong Kong's got a similar thing. They've brought in outsiders to ensure that there are people there who have got strong integrity. So the court system, you've got to have it, because ultimately some things can't be resolved through facilitation or mediation. Yes. But you're absolutely right. The more you continue on this, in this temporal sense, from I've got an issue with, we've got an issue in the family, we've got an issue in the joint venture, we've got an issue with our licensee of the pharmaceutical distribution, whatever it's going to be, products, and you head to court, the commercial outcomes just diminish.
Yes.
And if you talk to the business people, and lawyers so many lawyers, they just get caught up in the process. The business people, by and large, hate it. Yeah. They hate it. It's uncertain, it's expensive, and it's time consuming. I mean, most CEOs want to be out there making money for their shareholders and doing, going back to Larry Fink and fulfilling those objectives. They don't want to be caught up in litigation. And I was with someone recently, and I was talking about the time it takes away from executives. And this executive said to me, we've got a very significant one. And I said, oh, it's bad luck. And he said, it's not just affecting me, it's affecting the entire C-suite. Yeah. And you think to yourself, well, I don't know what it is, but it's that's not good. But the advantage of the mediation, I've always said, the real advantage is the creativity. If you've got a clever person or good lawyers who are creative, and a mediator who's across things and working well, then you're only really bound by your obviously some facts and things like that, but creativity is there. So how are you going to cut the deal? What's a new way of cutting the JV? And if the entity has to go into liquidation, fine, but there may be other avenues, etc., where it can be explored. So that to me is what's lost.
Yeah, I think there's two things there. One is what's always of interest to me, looking at disputes that get to court, and you and I have seen these over the years, is when we lose the nexus between the failure and the recovery of money. And I know jobs, we've both seen that there might have been a failure in 1989 and then there's a recovery in 2016. Well, there's no nexus between the people who lost the money and the beneficiaries of that money. So that can only be classified as a failure in my view. Something's gone wrong. Something's gone terribly wrong if we've allowed that to occur, I think, don't you?
Well, I mean, you could probably do...
I won't name the jobs. You've been involved in a few. So.
I did one in Western Australia, which is infamous, and went for 28 years.
Yeah. The second part of that is, and you do need principals to remain involved and keep the right people there, and you need mediations to be taken seriously though in that context, don't you?
Yeah.
And I think we do see mediation sometimes if the principals and the lawyers have lost touch with what they're doing, they see mediation as a step to begin the litigation. So let's just touch on that for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and it's a very good point. Let me just talk about offshore Middle East. Culturally, in some jurisdictions, the mediations haven't succeeded. In Abu Dhabi recently, or in Dubai recently, one of the leading Emirati lawyers there addressed a large gathering and said, we have to do more in mediation. There is a real concern in some countries that if the government's involved, no one will want to make a decision to pay money, for example, to the other side, for fear that ultimately, did they really have the authority to sign off to pay the money? Yeah. So it's a lot safer for some people just to let matters go to arbitration. But that's culturally in some places. In other areas, just not having the right people at the mediation. Again, as I said earlier, an example, people who were involved in doing the deal sometimes are the very people who should not be in the mediation.
And indeed, the lawyers running the proceeding sometimes are not the right lawyers.
True. I mean, I know some entities, for example, will not use the lawyer who did the documentation. They'll use someone else. But I think that's part of the preliminaries before you spend time on it, making sure you've got the right people there. And I was with someone just recently and, they were talking about in Australia and a government department involved, and it was very difficult to achieve an outcome because there was a sense that the relevant government officials didn't want this to go ahead. So they worked through it. They found a solution ultimately, but other people became involved. So it comes down to the right people and authority in some cases. At a corporate level, making sure, I say to some people, one of the questions in large organisations is who's actually funding this? I mean, it's coming from X company, but it's coming out of someone's P&L.
Yeah.
And it's coming out of a business's P&L. And that's going to have an impact on that business. It's going to have an impact on bonuses, KPIs, etc. So just be mindful of that and before you actually go in. So that's part of the role of the mediator, I see, to sort of explore behind the scenes whether the right people are there.
Yeah. Whereas the mediations we see, someone has scheduled 2 days and off we go. Well, that's,
The North American and European experience, I think, is, and mine, is that, the idea that you'll turn up next Wednesday week and you and I will have,
a roadmap for settlement.
and there'll be, 5, 10 or more parties in a room and we'll settle it in 2 days is just completely fanciful.
Yeah.
It's just not going to happen. So I think, again, the more complicated, the iterative processes, it takes time. And sometimes people aren't genuinely ready for it. But what I think you do is, by having it, and having a framework for facilitation or mediation, but it's like driving in the car. Exit 64 is coming up. No, we won't take it this time. We might take, but suddenly 68 comes along and you go, maybe we might take this. So it's a slip road off at some point, but you've set up the framework to do it.
And let me talk about corporate law reform only for a second. And there's been a lot of criticism, of course, of Australian law in insolvency. There was a corporate law reform report in the PJC last year, 2 years ago, 18 months ago. We've seen a lot of piecemeal reform around safe harbour and SBR, but nothing in this area. How do you think we institutionalise this between something in the courts and something in commerce and something in the law and something in the psychology of restructuring? How does all that work?
I think it'd be good to get a bunch of thought leaders together to work through this. Breaking it down, if you wanted to get various stakeholders together, then they'll probably want to have some confidentiality obligations. Governments may feel a bit constrained by that early on, but they'll want to have some confidentiality. You want to have something where if people behave in an aberrant way, that can be called out. So how you can call it out, and sunlight's often a great disinfectant. So the fact that someone just folded their arms and sat there and didn't want to participate, contribute, do you want, is that going to be the best redress that people have got? It might be the first step in redress, and if they haven't called it out, then the fact that that's public, that if they haven't contributed in a structural sense to a settlement, then we can leave it to Joe Aston to
sort that out
for us, because it'll make good reading, it'll make good copy, and Joe does an amazing job at getting under the hood on that sort of stuff. Whether you then take another step, for example, and just say that before you go to court, as in some jurisdictions, that you have to say that we've tried mediation. That can itself be abused, because people can say we've tried mediation, they didn't really try.
Yes, indeed.
But if you then said, okay, someone's in the law reform, that there had been a mediator or facilitator actually has to say that the parties attended in good faith and exercise skill and judgment to try and bring it back.
And we gave it time, and the parties have indicated that they've committed to that process. The individual's a legitimate, credible, experienced, trusted person.
And, so, you can see you can layer on some things. You can start with just media, the Sunlight soap. issue. You can start with, you can't file process in certain matters until you've ticked a box saying you've tried mediation. You can add to that by adding a bit more around, a report from somebody. Now, okay, you can get into the details. What does the report have, etc. So, but these things are not insoluble. And one of the things that I suspect, and there may be exceptions needed because things may be critical, have to move very fast, etc. But they're not insoluble, I don't think. And they'd be the areas that I think if I was involved in law reform, I'd be thinking, what are the things where, structurally, I want to create a framework which will make people be more thoughtful to consider these matters in a timely way. And you can't just turn up and roll your arm over. I mean, it's more than that. So whether you're an off-taker of product, whether you're a supplier, a contractor, whoever's going to be part of these stakeholders, so it may well be more than just creditors.
It takes time to embed these things in the psychology of business too, doesn't it?
Yeah, but if you see the outcome is better,
yes,
then and you see people there's been a bit of give and take,
yes,
then before it goes, before it heads to a court or an insolvency administration, people, I dare say, will probably say, okay, it was well worthwhile.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at Safe Harbour as a change in the restructuring landscape 7 years in, I think finally people are beginning to talk about that as working, right, and are happy to say, well, yes, we've been through that kind of process. So it does take time, I think, and a change in psychology. So something more than the individuals who are involved.
Yeah. And I think our society's matured a lot too. I mean, the people recognise that there are roles to play for NGOs and the union movement, and it's not just an us and them approach. We have a country where we have to focus on productivity. We have to focus on innovation, and
we do have fully formed institutions who are good at that.
Yeah. So bearing in mind if those things, if we have those as goals and we think they're achievable, it's like governance. APRA puts out its report yesterday on governance. There's unless you've got a framework, sometimes. It's like building a building and not knowing exactly where the hydraulics are or the electrical wiring system, etc. So you've got to have something. So having some guiding principles or whatever, but there might have to be some sorts of sanctions if you don't do that. But I certainly wouldn't want to be sitting here and being prescriptive, saying there's fines and penalties. I'm not suggesting that. I think this is a more nuanced approach. And it needs some discussion and thought with financiers and others, AICD, to work through the mechanics of how this would work effectively. But if our goal is clear, then it seems to me it can be achieved.
Well, it sounds like a wonderful call out, I think, to the industry or to society to say, well, there's things that can be done here, and we just need to find the forums to make them happen.
Yeah.
Final thoughts, Tim?
I think final thoughts. Look, I've spent my life in courts. You reach an age like I do where you sit back and you think there are better ways to resolve matters in the commercial world, and I think we need to be just a bit smarter and a bit more nimble, and address issues earlier on. And when I started, I did the first probably major mediation in Australia with Sir Lawrence Street, and that was in Spedley, 1992.
I was involved.
Spedley, I think, spawned something like 55 pieces of litigation were involved in the Supreme Court. And Lawrence used to just say, he came along and he said, we should try and settle matters. And there was incredible cynicism. I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, fancy trying to settle matters.
Yes.
I mean, what, using a mediator? I mean, like, it was absurd. And he used to start a mediation, and he often would bring an orange into the room, and he'd put an orange in the middle of the table, and he would say, "Joe, do you want the orange?" And Joe would say, "Yeah, I want the orange." "Tim, do you want the orange?" "Yeah, I want the orange." "Why do you want the orange, Joe?" And Joe would say, "Well, I'm a high-performance athlete. I actually want it because I've been exercising this morning and I just want the juice." "Tim, why do you want the orange?" "Well, I'm a lousy cook, but I do quite like the zest from the skin." And Lawrence would say, "So, Tim and Joe, you can both have what you want."
That's right.
But he also used to then say everyone should walk out of a mediation feeling just a little bit disappointed.
Yes, yeah, indeed.
And but that's 1992. So that's what's that? My maths, 35, 30 plus years.
Yes.
But there we go from in 30 years ago, complete cynicism about even this concept, where
Yes.
now it's a global phenomenon in most jurisdictions.
Yes, yes.
Singapore government's really behind it, for example, mandating it there. To now this, I think, continual evolution as to how we actually resolve bigger issues with more people.
Yes.
In a legal sense, people who are outside the contractual relationships. They're not the lender, they're not the employee, but there might be others who are impacted. So it's really just an extension of that. And I suspect if we look, in 10 years' time, we may look back on this podcast and say, that was interesting. They were talking about that. That either fell over.
They got
or
nowhere, those two guys.
Those guys, they're off on a folly. Or it was like the Lawrence Street moment where it started to, we started to have a more mature approach to resolution of, in situations where there are parties involved, as I say, which are not necessarily in a contractual relationship.
Well, you heard it here first. Lawrence Street, the Orange and Spedley Securities. Tim, thank you very much for joining us on The Turnaround. We'll keep talking about this.
Many thanks, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.